Welcome to the place where you can relax. The stories here are boring, but this is what you are here for. Just close your eyes and let literature do her magic. Extracts from the Religion of the Ancient Celts by J. MacCulloch, first published in 1911. The Gods of the Britons. Our knowledge of the gods of the Britons, i.e. as far as Wales is concerned, is derived, apart from inscriptions, from the Mabinogion, which, though found in a 14th century MS, was composed much earlier and contains elements from a remote past. Besides this, the Triads, probably a 12th century origin, the Taliesin, and other poems, though obscure and artificial, the work of many a confused bard driveling, to cite the words of one of them, preserve echoes of the old mythology. Some of the gods may lurk behind the personages of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Brittonum and of the Arthurian cycle, though here great caution is required. The divinities have become heroes and heroines, kings and princesses, and if some of the episodes are based on ancient myths, they are treated in a romantic spirit. Other episodes are mere American formulae, like the wreckage of some rich galleon. The debris of the old mythology has been used to construct a new fabric, and the old divinities have even less of the godlike traits of the personages of the Irish texts. Some of the personages bear similar names to the Irish divinities, and in some cases there is a certain similarity of incidents to those of the Irish tales. Are, then, the gods dimly revealed in Welsh literature as much Goidelic as Brythonic? Analyzing the incidents of the Mabinogion, Professor Anwell has shown that they have an entirely local character and are mainly associated with the district of Dyfed and Gwent, of Anglesey and of Gwynedd, of which Pryderi, Branwen, and Gwydion are respectively the heroic characters. These are the districts where a strong Goidelic element prevailed, whether these Goidels were the original inhabitants of Britain, driven there by Britons, or tribes who had settled there from Ireland, or perhaps a mixture of both. In any case, they have been conquered by Britons and have become Brythonic in speech from the 5th century onwards. On account of this Goidelic element, it has been claimed that the personages of the Mabinogion are purely Goidelic, but examination proves that only a few are directly parallel in name with Irish divinities, and while here there are fundamental likenesses, the incidents with Irish parallels may be due to mere superficial borrowings, to that interchange of American and mythical dons which has everywhere occurred. Many incidents have no Irish parallels, and most of the characters are entirely different in name from Irish divinities. Hence any theory which would account for the likenesses must also account for the differences, and must explain why, if the Mabinogion is due to Irish Goidels, there should have been few or no borrowings in Welsh literature from the popular Cuchulainn and Ossianic sagas, and why, at a time when Brythonic elements were uppermost, such care should have been taken to preserve Goidelic myths. If the tales emanated from native Welsh Goidels, the explanation might be that they, the kindred of the Irish Goidels, must have had a certain community with them in divine names and myths, while others of their gods, more local in character, would differ in name. Or if they are Brythonic, the likenesses might be accounted for by an early community in myth and cult among the common ancestors of Britons and Goidels. But as the date of the composition of the Mabinogion is comparatively late, at a time when Britons had overrun these Goidelic districts, more probably the tales contain a mingling of Goidelic, Irish or Welsh, and Brythonic divinities, though some of these may be survivals of the common Celtic heritage. Celtic divinities were mainly of a local, tribal character. Hence, some would be local Goidelic divinities. Others, classed with these, local Brythonic divinities. This would explain the absence of divinities and heroes of other local Brythonic groups, e.g. Arthur, from the Mabinogion. But with the growing importance of these, they attracted to their legend the folk of the Mabinogion and other tales. These are associated with Arthur and Coolwich, and the Don group mingles with that of Taliesin in the Taliesin poems. Hence Welsh literature, as far as concerns the old religion, may be regarded as including both local Goidelic and Brythonic divinities, of whom the more purely Brythonic are Arthur Gwyn, Taliesin, etc. They are regarded as kings and queens, or as fairies, or they have magical powers. They are mortal and die, and the place of their burial is pointed out, or existing tumuli are associated with them. All this is parallel to the history of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and shows how the same process of degradation had been at work in Wales as in Ireland. The story of the Ellyr group is told in the Mabinogion of Branwen and of Manawyddan. They are associated with the Pool group and apparently opposed to that of Don. Branwen is married to Matholwich, king of Ireland, but is ill-treated by him on account of the insults of the mischievous of Nisian, in spite of the fact that Bran had atoned for the insult by many gifts, including that of a cauldron of regeneration. Now he crosses with an army to Ireland, where Nisian throws Branwen's child, to whom the kingdom is given, on the fire. A fight ensues. The dead Irish warriors are resuscitated in the cauldron, but Nisian, at the cost of his life, destroys it. Bran is slain, and by his directions his head is cut off and carried first to Harlech, then to Gwales, where it will entertain its bearers for 80 years. At the end of that time it is to be taken to London and buried. Branwen, departing with the bearers, dies of a broken heart at Anglesey, and meanwhile Caswlin, son of Beli, seizes the kingdom. Two of the bearers of the head are Manawyddan and Pryderi, whose fortunes we follow in the Mabinogi of the former. Pryderi gives his mother Rhiannon to Manawyddan as his wife, along with some land which by magic art is made barren. After following different crafts, they are led by a boar to a strange castle, where Rhiannon and Pryderi disappear along with the building. Manawyddan, with Pryderi's wife Kiva, set out as shoemakers, but are forced to abandon this craft on account of the envy of the craftsmen. Finally, we learn how Manawyddan overcame the enchanter Llwyt, who, because of an insult offered by Pryderi's father to his friend Gwal, had made Rhiannon and Pryderi disappear. They are now restored, and Llwyt seeks no further revenge. The story of Branwen is similar to a tale of which there are variants in Teutonic and Scandinavian sagas, but the resemblance is closer to the latter. Possibly a similar story with their respective divinities or heroes for its characters existed among Celts, Teutons, and Norsemen, but more likely it was borrowed from Norsemen who occupied both sides of the Irish Sea in the 9th and 10th century, and then naturalized by furnishing it with Celtic characters. But into this framework many native elements were set, and we may therefore scrutinize the story for Celtic mythical elements utilized by its redactor, who probably did not strip its Celtic personages of their earlier divine attributes. In the two Mabinogi, these personages are Ellyr, his sons Bran and Manawyddan, his daughter Branwen, their half-brothers Nisian and Nisian, sons of Ellyr's wife Penardim, daughter of Beli, by a previous marriage with Euroswyd. Llyr's equivalent of the Irish Lur, the sea god, but two other Ellyres, probably duplicates of himself, are known to Welsh story, Ellyr Marini and the Ellyr Father Cordelia of the chroniclers. He is constantly confused with Lud Lawrite. E.g. both are described as one of three notable prisoners of Britain, and both are called fathers of Cordelia or Crady Lad. Perhaps the two were once identical, for Manannan is sometimes called son of Alloyd, equals Lud, in Irish texts, as well as son of Lur, but the confusion may be accidental. Nor is it certain that Nodons or Lud was a sea god. Ellyr's prison was that of Euroswyd, whose wife he may have abducted and hence suffered imprisonment. In the Black Book of Caermarthen, Bran is called son of Weird or Ocean, according to M. Loth's interpretation of the name, which would thus point to Ellyr's position as a sea god. But this is contested by Professor R.H. Carrot-Wyss, who makes Yweret wife of Ellyr, the name being in his view a form of the Welsh word for Ireland. In Geoffrey and the chroniclers, Ellyr becomes a king of Britain whose history, and that of his daughters, was immortalized by Shakespeare. Geoffrey also refers to Ellyr's burial in a vault built in honor of Janus. On this, Professor R.H. Carrot-Wyss builds a theory that Lyr was a form of the Celtic Dis with two faces and ruler of a world of darkness. But there is no evidence that the Celtic Despater was lord of the gloomy underworld, and it is best to regard Lyr as a sea divinity. Manawyddan is not godlike in these tales in the sense in which the majestic Manannan of Irish story is, though elsewhere we learn that deep was his counsel. Though not a magician, he baffles one of the great wizards of Welsh story, and he is also a master craftsman who instructs Pryderi in the arts of shoemaking, shield-making, and saddlery. In this, he is akin to Manannan, the teacher of Dermot. Incidents of his career are reflected in the triads, and his union with Rhiannon may point to an old myth in which they were from the first a divine pair, parents of Pryderi. This would give point to his deliverance of Pryderi and Rhiannon from the hostile magician. Rhiannon resembles the Irish Elysium goddesses, and Manawyddan, like Manannan, is lord of Elysium in a Taliesin poem. He is a craftsman and follows agriculture, perhaps a reminiscence of the old belief that fertility and culture come from the gods' land. Manawyddan, like other divinities, was drawn into the Arthurian cycle and is one of those who capture the famous boar, the TWRCHTRWYDH. Bran, or Bendegite Vran, Bran the Blessed, probably an old pagan title which appropriately enough denotes one who figured later in Christian hagiology, is so huge that no house or ship can hold him. Hence he wades over to Ireland, and as he draws near is thought to be a mountain. This may be an archaic method of expressing his divinity, a gigantic non-natural man, like some of the Dath Dé and Ossianic heroes. But Bran also appears as the Erdal Ben, or noble head, which makes time pass to his bearers like a dream, and when buried protects the land from invasion. Both as a giant squatting on a rock and as a head, Bran is equated by Professor Arch Carrot-West with Sir Nunnos, the squatting god, represented also as a head, and also with the Welsh Urien, whose attribute was a raven, the supposed meaning of Bran's name. He further equates him with other Ben, wonderful head, the superior bard, harper, and piper of a Taliesin poem. Urien, Bran, and other are three forms of a god worshipped by bards, and a dark divinity, whose wading over to Ireland signifies crossing to Hades, of which he, like Yama, who first crossed the rapid waters to the land of death, is the ruler. But Bran is not a dark god in the sense implied here. Sir Nunnos has got a happy underworld, and there is nothing dark or evil in him or in Bran and his congeners. Professor R.H. Carrot-Y.S.'s dark divinities are sometimes, in his view, like gods, but they cannot be both. The Celtic lords of the dead had no dark character, and as gods of fertility they were, so to speak, in league with the sun god, the slayer of Bran, according to Professor R. Carrot-Y.S.'s ingenious theory. And although the distracted Irish secretary's Ireland may be Hades, its introduction into this Mabinogi merely points to the interpretation of a mythico-historic connection between Wales and Ireland. Thus, if Bran is Sir Nunnos, this is because he is a lord of the underworld of fertility, the counterpart of which is the distant Elysium, to which Bran seems rather to belong. Thus, in presence of his head, time passes as a dream in feasting and joy. This is a true Elysian note, and the tabooed door of the story is also suggestive of the taboos of Elysium, which when broken rob men of happiness. As to the power of the head in protecting the land, this points to actual custom and belief regarding the relics of the dead and the power of divine images or sculptured heads. The god Bran has become a king and lawgiver in the Mabinogion and the Triads, while Geoffrey of Monmouth describes how Belinus and Brennus, in the Welsh version Beli and Bran, dispute the crown of Britain, are reconciled, and finally conquer Gaul and Rome. The mythic Bran is confused with Brennus, leader of the Gauls against Rome in BC, and Belinus may be the god Belinos, as well as Beli, father of Lud and Caswallon. But Bran also figures as a Christian missionary. He is described as hostage at Rome for his son Caradoc, returning thence as preacher of Christianity to the Cymri, a legend arising out of misunderstanding of his epithet blessed, and a confusing of his son with the historic Caractacus. Hence Bran's family is spoken of as one of the 3 saintly families of Prydian, and he is ancestor of many saints. Branwen, white bosom, daughter of a sea god, maybe a sea goddess, Venus of the northern sea, unless with Mr. Nut we connect her with a cauldron described in her legend, symbol of an orgiastic cult, and regard her as a goddess of fertility. But the connection is not clear in the story, though in some earlier myth the cauldron may have been her property. As Brangwain, she reappears in romance, giving a love potion to Tristram, perhaps a reminiscence of her former functions as a goddess of love or earlier fertility. In the Mabinogion, she is buried in Anglesey at Wynwyas Bronwyn, where a cairn with bones discovered and was held to be the grave and remains of Branwen. The children of Don, the equivalent of Danu, and probably like her, a goddess of fertility, are Gwydion Gilvathwy, Amathon Govanen, and Arianrod, with her sons Dylan and Lugh. These correspond, therefore, in part to the Tothadé, though the only members of the group who bear names similar to the Irish gods are Govanen, equals Goibniu, and possibly Lugh, equals Lug. Gwydion as a culture god corresponds to Ogma. In the triads, Beli is called father of Arianrod, and assuming that this Arianrod is identical with the daughter of Don, Professor R.H. Carrot-Wyss regards Beli as husband of Don, but the identification is far from certain, and the theory built upon it that Beli is one with the Irish bile, and that both are lords of the dark underworld, has already been found precarious. In later belief, Dawn was associated with the stars, the constellation Cassiopeia being called her court. She is described as wise in a Taliesin poem. This group of divinities is met with mainly in the Mabinogia math, which turns upon Gilvathwy's illicit love of math's footholder, Golwyn, to assist him in his amour, Gwydion, by a magical trick, procures for math from the court of Pryderi certain swine sent him by Araun, king of Anwinfin. In the battle which follows when the trick is discovered, Gwydion slays Pryderi by enchantment. Math now discovers that Gilvathwy has seduced Golwyn and transforms him and Gwydion successively into deer, swine, and wolves. Restored to human form, Gwydion proposes that Arianrod should be Math's footholder, but Math by a magic test discovers that she is not a virgin. She bears 2 sons, Dylan, fostered by Math, and another whom Gwydion nurtures and for whom he afterwards by a trick obtains a name from Arianrod, who had sworn never to name him. The name is Lulaw Gifs, Lion of the Sure Hand. By magic, Math and Gwydion form a wife for Luata Flowers. She is called Blodud, and later, at the instigation of a lover, Granu, she discovers how Lugh can be killed. Granu attacks and wounds him, and he flies off as an eagle. Gwydion seeks for Lugh, discovers him, and retransforms him to human shape. Then he changes Blodud into an owl and slays Granu. Several independent tales have gone to the formation of this Mabinogi, but we are concerned here merely with the light it may throw on the divine characters who figure in it. Math or Mathen, the Ancient, is probably an old divinity of Gwynd, of which he is called Lord. He is a king and a magician, preeminent in wizardry, which he teaches the Gwydion, and in a triad he is called one of the great men of magic and metamorphosis of Britain. More important are his traits of goodness to the suffering, and justice with no trace of vengeance to the wrongdoer. Whether these are derived from his character as a god or from the Celtic kingly ideal, it is impossible to say, though the former is by no means unlikely. Possibly his supreme magical powers make him the equivalent of the Irish god of Druidism, but this is uncertain, since all gods are more or less dowered with these. Gwydion's magical powers are abundantly illustrated in the tale. At Pryderi's court, he changes fungus into horses and dogs, and afterwards slays Pryderi by power of enchantments. He produces a fleet by magic before Arianrod's castle. With Math's help, he forms Blodud out of flowers. He gives Lugh his natural shape when he finds him as a wasted eagle on a tree, his flesh and the worms breeding in it dropping from him. He transforms the faithless Blodud into an owl. Some of these and other deeds are referred to in the Taliesin poems, while Taliesin describes himself as enchanted by Gwydion. In the triads, he is one of the 3 great astrologers of Prydian, and this emphasis laid on his powers of divination is significant when it is considered that his name may be derived from a root vet, giving words meaning saying, or poetry, while cognate words are Irish faith, a prophet or poet, German with rage, and the name of Odin. The name is suggestive of the ecstasy of inspiration, producing prophetic and poetic utterance. In the Mabinogion, he is a mighty bard, and in a poem, he, under the name of Gwir, is imprisoned in the otherworld, and there becomes a bard, thus receiving inspiration from the gods' land. He is the ideal faith, diviner, prophet, and poet, and thus the god of those professing these arts. Strabo describes how the Celtic faith was also a philosopher, and this character is given in a poem to Cian, probably equals Gwydion, whose artists are poets and magicians, but he is also a culture god, bringing swine to men from the gods' land. For though Pryderi is described as a mortal who has himself received the swine from Anon from Elysium, there is no doubt that he himself was a lord of Anwulfn, and it was probably on account of Gwydion's death from Anwulfn that he, as Gwir, was imprisoned there through the messenger of Pwyll and Pryderi. A raid is here made directly on the gods' land for the benefit of men, and it is unsuccessful, but in the Mabinogi a different version of the raid is told. Perhaps Gwydion also brought kine from Anwulfn, since he is called one of the 3 herds of Britain, while he himself may once have been an animal god, then an anthropomorphic deity associated with animals. Thus in the Mabinogi, when Gwydion flees with the swine, he rests each night at a place one of the syllables of which is mach, swine, an ideological myth explaining why places which were once sites of the cult of the swine god, afterwards worshipped as Gwydion, were so called. Gwydion is also a tricky, fraudulent character in the Mabinogi, and although in his life there was counsel, yet he had a vicious muse. It is also implied that he is lover of his sister Arianrod and father of Dylan and Lugh, the mythic reflections of a time when such unions, perhaps only in royal houses, were permissible. Instances occur in Irish tales, and Arthur was also his sister's lover. In later belief, Gwydion was associated with the stars, and the Milky Way was called Cair Gwydion. Across it, he had chased a faithless Blodud. Professor R.H. YSE equates him with Odin, and regards both as representing an older Celto-Teutonic hero, though many of the alleged similarities in their respective mythologies are not too obvious. Amathon the Good is described in Coolwich as the only husbandman who could till or dress a certain piece of land, though Coolwich will not be able to force him or to make him follow him. This, together with the name Amathon, from Cymric Amath, laborer or plowman, throws some light on his functions. He was a god associated with agriculture, either as one who made waste places fruitful or possibly as an anthropomorphic corn divinity. But elsewhere is taking a roebuck and a whelp, and in a triad, a lapwing from Araun. King of Anwulfn, led to the Battle of Godu, in which he fought Araun, aided by Gwydion, who vanquished one of Araun's warriors, Bran, by discovering his name. Amathon, who brings useful animals from the gods' land, plays the same part as Gwydion, bringer of the swine. The dog and deer are frequent representatives of the corn spirit, of which Amathon may have been an anthropomorphic form, or they, with a lapwing, may have been earlier worshipful animals, associated with Amathon as his symbols, while later myth told how he procured them from Anwulfn. The divine functions of the law gifs are hardly apparent in the Mabinogi. The incident of Blodud's unfaithfulness is simply that of the American formula of the treacherous wife who discovers the secret of her husband's life and thus puts him at her lover's mercy. But since Lugh is not slain, but changes to eagle form, this unusual ending may mean that he was once a bird divinity, the eagle later becoming his symbol. Some myth must have told of his death, or he was afterward regarded as a mortal who died, for a poem mentions his tomb and adds he was a man who never gave justice to anyone. Dr. Skeen suggests that truth, not justice, is here meant, and finds in this a reference to Lu's disguises. Professor R.H. Y.S., for reasons not held convincing by M. Loth, holds that Lu Lion was a misapprehension for his true name Leu, interpreted by him Light. This meaning he also gives a Lug, equating Lug and Lu, and regarding both as sun gods. He also equates Law Jifs, steady or strong hand, with Lug's epithet Lam Fada, long hand, suggesting that Jifs may have meant long, although it was Lu's steadiness of hand in shooting which earned him the title. Again, Lu's rapid growth need not make him the sun, for this was a privilege of many heroes who had no connection with the sun. Lu's unfortunate matrimonial affairs are also regarded as a sun myth. Blodud is a dawn goddess dividing her love between the sun god and the prince of darkness. Lu as the sun is overcome by the latter, but is restored by the culture hero Gwydion, who slays the dark rival. The transformation of Blodud into an owl means that the dawn has become the dusk. As we have seen, all this is American formula with no mythical significance. Evidence of precariousness of such an interpretation is furnished from the similar interpretation of the story of Curoy's wife, Blathnat, whose lover Cuchulainn slew Curoy. Here a supposed sun god is the treacherous villain who kills a dark divinity, husband of a dawn goddess. If Lu is a sun god, the equivalent of Lug, it is curious that he is never connected with the August festival in Wales, which corresponds to Lugnasad in Ireland. There may be some support to the theory which makes him a sun god in a triad, where he is one of the three Rudrok who cause a year's sterility wherever they set their feet, though in this Arthur excels them, for he causes 7 years sterility. Does this point to the scorching of vegetation by the summer sun? The mythologists have not made use of this incident. On the whole, the evidence for Lu as a sun god is not convincing. The strongest reason for identifying him with Lug rests on the fact that both have uncles who are smiths and have similar names, Govanen and Gavada Goigniu, like Amathon Govanen, the artificer or smith Goff Smith. It is mentioned in Coolwich as one whose help must be gained to wait at the end of the furrows to cleanse the iron of the plough. Here he is brought into connection with the plough, but the myth to which the words refer is lost. A Taliesin poem associates him with math. I have been with artificers, with the old math and with Govanen, and refers to his care or castle. Arianrod, Silver Wheel, has a twofold character. She pretends to be a virgin and disclaims all knowledge of her son Lu. Yet she is mistress of Gwydion. In the triads, she appears as one of the three blessed, or white, ladies of Britain. Perhaps these two aspects of her character may point to a divergence between religion and mythology, the cult of a virgin goddess of whom myth told discreditable things. More likely she was an old earth goddess, at once a virgin and a fruitful mother, like Artemis, the virgin goddess, yet neither chaste nor fair, or like a Babylonian goddess addressed as at once mother, wife, and maid. Arianrod, beauty famed beyond summer's dawn, is mentioned in a Taliesin poem, and she was later associated with the constellation Corona Borealis. Possibly her real name was forgotten, and that of Arianrod derived from a place name, Caer Arianrod, associated with her. The interpretation which makes her a dawn goddess, mother of light, Leu, and darkness, Dylan, is far from obvious. Dylan, after his baptism, rushed into the sea, the nature which became his. No wave ever broke under him. He swam like a fish, and hence was called Dylan Altan, or son of the wave. Govanen, his uncle, slew him, an incident interpreted as the defeat of darkness, which hies away to lurk in the sea. Dylan, however, has no dark traits, and is described as a blonde. The waves lament his death, and, as they dash against the shore, seek to avenge it. His grave is where the wave make a sullen sound, but popular belief identifies with the waves, and their noise as they press into Conway is his dying groan. Not only is he Al-Tun, son of the wave, but also Al-Mor, son of the sea. He is thus a local sea god, and like Manan identified with the waves, and yet separate from them, since they mourn his death. The Mabinogi gives us the debris of myths explaining how an anthropomorphic sea god was connected with the goddess Arianrod and slain by a god Govanen. Another Mabinogian group is that of Pul, Prince of Dive, his wife Rhiannon, and their son Pryderi. Pul agrees with Araun, king of Anwulf Elysium, to reign over his kingdom for a year. At the end of that time, he slays Araun's rival Havgon. Araun sends him gifts, and Pul is now known as Pen or Head of Anwulf, a title showing that he was once a god, belonging to the god's land, later identified with the Christian Hades. Pul now agrees with Rhiannon, who appears mysteriously on a magic hillock, and whom he captures, to rid her of an unwelcome suitor Gwal. He imprisons in a magical bag, and Rhiannon weds Pul. The story thus resolves itself into the formula of the fairy bride, but it paves the way for the vengeance taken on Pryderi and Rhiannon by Gwal's friend LLW Wyke. Rhiannon has a son who is stolen as soon as born. She is accused of slaying him and is degraded, but Terranon recovers the child from its superhuman robber and calls him Gree. As he grows up, Terranon notices his resemblance to Pul and takes him to his court. Rhiannon is reinstated, and because she cries that her anguished Pryderi is gone, the boy is now called Pryderi. Here, again, we have American incidents, which also appear in the Finn saga, though there is little that is mythological here. It is evident that Pul is a god and Rhiannon a goddess, whose early importance, like that of other Celtic goddesses, appears from her name, a corruption of Rhygentona, Great Queen. Elsewhere we hear of her magic birds whose song charmed Bran's companions for 7 years, and of her marriage to Manawyddan, an old myth in which Manawyddan may have been Pryderi's father, while possibly in some other myth Pryderi may have been child of Rhygentona and Terranon, equals Tigernon's king. We may postulate an old Rhiannon saga, fragments of which are to be found in the Mabinogi, and there may have been more than one goddess called Rhygentona, later fused into one. But in the tales, she is merely a queen of old romance. Pryderi, as has been seen, was despoiled of his swine by Gwydion. They were the gift of Araun, but in the triads they seem to have been brought from Anwulf by Pul, while Pryderi acted as swineherd. Both Pul and Pryderi are thus connected with those myths which told the bringing of domestic animals from the god's land. But since they are certainly gods associated with the god's land, this is perhaps the result of misunderstanding. A poem speaks of the magic cauldron of Pen Anwulf, i.e. Pul, and this points to a myth explaining his connection with Anwulf in a different way from the account in the Mabinogi. The poem also tells how Gwir was imprisoned in Caer Sidi, equals Anwulf, through the messenger of Pul and Pryderi. They are thus lord of Anwulf, whose swine Gwir Gwydion tries to steal. Elsewhere, Caer Sidi is associated with Manawyddan and Pryderi, perhaps a reference to their connection as father and son. Thus Pryderi and Pul belong to the bright Elysium, and may once have been gods of fertility associated with the Underearth region, which was by no means a world of darkness. Whatever be the meaning of the death of Pryderi at the hands of Gwydion, it is connected with later references to his grave. A fourth group is that of Beli and his sons, referred to in the Mabinogi of Branwen, where one of them, Caswallon, usurps the throne, and thus makes Manawyddan, like MacGregor, landless. In the Dream of Maxon, the sons of Beli are Lud, Caswallon, Ninyaw, and Leavleys. Geoffrey calls Beli Heli, and speaks of an earlier king Belinus, at enmity with his brother Brennius. But probably Beli or Heli and Belinus are one and the same, and both represent the earlier god Belinos. Caswallon becomes Cassivellaunus, opponent of Caesar, but in the Mabinogi he is hostile to the race of Eloir, and this may be connected with whatever underlies Geoffrey's account of the hostility of Belinus and Brennius, equals Bran, son of Eloir. Perhaps, like the enmity of the race of D. Caradon to Pryderi, a reminiscence of the strife of rival tribes, or of Goidel and Britton. As has been seen, the evidence for regarding Beli as D. Carat Owen's consort or the equivalent of Bile is slender, nor, if he is Belinos, the equivalent of Apollo, is he in any sense a dark god. He is regarded as a victorious champion, preserver of his honey isle and the stability of his kingdom, in a Taliesin poem and in the Triads. The personality of Caswallon is lost in that of the historic Cassivelaunus, but in a reference to him in the Triads, where with Caradoc and Gwyred, he bears the title War King, we may see a glimpse of his divine character, that of a god of war, invisibly leading on armies to battle, and as such embodied in great chiefs who bore his name. Ninjal appears in Geoffrey's pages as Nennius, who dies of wounds inflicted by Caesar, to the great grief of Cassivelaunus. The theory that Ludlaw Irain or Lodin's Lamargenchos represents Nodin's Nuada, L equals a Margenchos, the change being the result of alliteration, has been contested. While the Welsh Lud and Nud were identical, it is strange that they should become distinct personalities. Gwyn, son of Nud, being the lover of Credilad, daughter of Lud, unless in some earlier myth their love was that of brother and sister. Lud is also confused or is identical with Loyr, just as the Irish slur is with Alloyd. He is probably the son of Beli who, in the tale of Lud and Leavleys, by the advice of Leavleys rids his country of 3 plagues. These are, first, the Coranians who hear every whisper, and whom he destroys by throwing over them water, in which certain insects given him by Leavleys have been bruised. The second is a shriek on May Eve which makes land and water barren, and is caused by a dragon which attacks the dragon to land. These Lud captures and imprisons at Dinah's Emrius, where they afterwards cause trouble to Vortigern at the building of his castle. The third is that of the disappearance of a year's supply of food by a magician, who lulls everyone to sleep and who is captured by Lud. Though the Coranians appear in the Triads as a hostile tribe, they may have been a supernatural folk, since their name is perhaps derived from Cor, dwarf, and they are now regarded as mischievous fairies. They may thus be analogous to Fomorians in their story, like that of the dragon and the magician who produce blight and loss of food, may be based on older myth or ritual embodying belief in powers hostile to fertility, though it is not clear why those powers should be most active on May Day. But this may be a misunderstanding, and the dragons are overcome on May Eve. The references in the tale to Lud's generosity and liberality in giving food may reflect his function as a god of growth, but like other euhemerized gods, he is also called a mighty warrior and is said to have rebuilt the walls of Caer Lud, London, his name still surviving in Ludgate Hill, where he was buried. This legend doubtless points to some ancient cult of Lud at this spot. Nud, already discussed under his title Nodons, is less prominent than his son Gwyn, whose fight with Guthor we have explained as a mythic explanation of ritual combats for the increase of fertility. He also appears as a hunter and as a great warrior, the hope of armies, and thus he may be a god of fertility who became a god of war in the chase. But legend associated him with Anlofn and regarded him, like the Tathaday, as a king of fairyland. In the legend of Es Colin, the saint tells 2 men, whom he overhears speaking of Gwyn and the fairies, that these are demons. "Thou shalt receive a reproof from Gwyn," said one of them, and soon after Colin was summoned to meet the king of Anlofn on Glastonbury Tor. He climbed the hill with a flask of holy water, and saw on its top a splendid castle, with crowds of beautiful and youthful folk, while the air resounded with music. He was brought to Gwyn, who politely offered him food, but "I will not eat of the leaves of the tree," cried the saint, and when he was asked to admire the dresses of the crowd, all he would say was that the red signified burning, the blue coldness. Then he threw the holy water over them, and nothing was left but the bare hillside. Though Gwyn's core on Glastonbury is a local Celtic Elysium, which was actually located there, the story marks the hostility of the church to the cult of Gwyn, perhaps practiced on hilltops, and this is further seen in the belief that he hunts souls of the wicked and is connected with Anlofn in its later sense of hell. But immediate view is found in Coolwich, where it is said of him that he restrains the demons of hell lest they should destroy the people of this world. In the Triads he is, like other gods, a great magician and astrologer. Another group, unknown to the Mabinogian, save that Taliesin is one of the bearers of Bran's head, is found in the Book of Taliesin and in the late story of Taliesin. These, like the Arthur cycle, often refer to personages of the Mabinogion. Hence we gather that local groups of gods, originally distinct, were later mingled in story, the references in the poems reflecting this mingling, laid as is the Haynes Taliesin or story of Taliesin, and expressed as much of it as an American formula. It is based on old myths about Ceridwen and Taliesin, of which his compiler made use, following an old tradition already stereotyped in one of the poems in the American formula of the transformation combat. But the mythical fragments are also mingled with traditions regarding the 6th century poet Taliesin. The older saga was perhaps developed in a district south of the Dyfi estuary. In Lake Tegid dwelled Tegidvol, Ceridwen, and their children, the fair maiden Crearwy, Morven, and the ugly Evagdu. To give Evagden knowledge, his mother prepares a cauldron of inspiration from which 3 drops of inspiration will be produced. These fall on the finger of Gwayan, whom she set to stir it. He put the finger in his mouth, and thus acquired the inspiration. He fled, and Ceridwen pursued, the rest of the story being accommodated to the transformation combat formula. Finally, Ceridwen as a hen swallows Gwayan as a grain of wheat, and bears him as a child, whom she throws into the sea. Elfin, who rescues him, calls him Taliesin, and brings him up as a bard. The water world of Tegid is a submarine Elysium with the customary cauldron of inspiration, regeneration, and fertility, like the cauldron associated with the water world in the Mabinogion. Shall not my chair be defended from the cauldron of Ceridwen? Runs a line in a Taliesin poem, while another speaks of her chair, which was probably an Elysium like that of Taliesin himself in Caer Sidi. Further references to her connection with poetry show that she may have been worshipped by bards, her cauldron being the source of their inspiration. Her anger at Gwayan may point to some form of the Celtic myth of the theft of the elements of culture from the god's land. But the cauldron was first of all associated with fertility cult, and Ceridwen must therefore once have been a goddess of fertility, who, like Bridget, was later worshipped by bards. She may also have been a corn goddess, since she is called a goddess of grain, and tradition associates the pig, a common embodiment of the corn spirit, with her. If the tradition is correct, this would be an instance, like that of Demeter and the pig, of an animal embodiment of the corn spirit being connected with a later anthropomorphic corn goddess. Taliesin was probably an old god of poetic inspiration, confused with the 6th century poet of the same name, perhaps because this boastful poet identified himself, or was identified by other bards with the gods. He speaks of his splendid chair, inspiration of fluent and urgent song in Caer Sidi or Elysium, and, speaking the god's name or identify himself with him, describes his presence with Lugh, Bran, Gwydion, and others, as well as his creation and his enchantment before he became immortal. He was present with Arthur when a cauldron was stolen from Onwin, and basing his verses on the mythic transformations and rebirths of the gods, recounts in highly inflated language his own numerous forms and rebirths. His claims resemble those of the shaman who has the entree of the spirit world and can transform himself at will. Taliesin's rebirth is connected with his acquiring of inspiration. These incidents appear separately in the story of Finn, who acquired his inspiration by an accident, and was also said to have been reborn as Mongan. They are myths common to various branches of the Celtic people, and applied in different combinations to outstanding gods or heroes. The Taliesin poems show that there may have been 2 gods or 2 mythic aspects of one god, later combined together. He is the son of the goddess and dwells in the divine land, but he is also a culture hero stealing from the divine land. Perhaps the myths reflect the encroachment of the cult of a god on that of a goddess, his worshippers regarding him as her son, her worshippers reflecting their hostility to the new god in a myth of her enmity to him. Finally, the legend of the rescue of Taliesin the poet from the waves became a myth of the divine outcast child rescued by Elfin, and proving himself a bard when normal infants are merely babbling. The occasional and obscure references to the other members of this group throw little light on their functions. Say that Morvran, see Crow, is described in Coolwich as so ugly and terrible that no one would strike him at the Battle of Camlin. He may have been a war god, like the Skullcrow goddesses of Ireland, and he is also spoken of in the Triads as an obstructive slaughter or support of battle. Ingenuity and speculation have busied themselves with trying to prove that the personages of the Arthurian cycle are the old gods of the Britons, and the incidents of the romances fragments of the old mythology. While some of these personages, those already present in genuinely old Welsh tales and poems or in Geoffrey's history, are reminiscent of the old gods, the romantic presentment of them in the cycle itself is so largely imaginative that nothing certain can be gained from it for the understanding of the old mythology, much less the old religion. Incidents which are the common stock of real life as well as of romance are interpreted mythologically, and it is never quite obvious why the slaying of one hero by another should signify the conquest of a dark divinity by a solar hero, or why the capture a heroine by one knight, when she is beloved of another, should make her a dawn goddess sharing her favors, now with the sun god, now with a dark divinity. Or, even granting the truth of this method, what light does it throw on Celtic religion? We may postulate a local Arthur saga, fusing an old Brythonic god with the historic 6th century Arthur. From this, or from Geoffrey's, handling of it sprang the great Romantic cycle. In the 9th century, Nennius Arthur is a historic war chief, possibly Count Britain, but in the reference to his hunting the Porcus Troit, the TWRCH, the mythic Arthur momentarily appears. Geoffrey's Arthur differs from the later Arthur of romance, and he may have partially rationalized the saga, which was either of recent formation or else local and obscure, since there is no reference to Arthur the Mabinogion, a fact which shows that in the legends of Gwynedd and Dyfed, he had no place whatever, and also that Arthur the god or mythic hero was also purely local. In Geoffrey, Arthur is the fruit of Igerna's amour with Uther, to whom Merlin has given her husband's shape. Arthur conquers many hosts as well as giants, and his court is a resort of all valorous persons. But he is at last wounded by his wife's seducer, and carried to the Isle of Avalon to be cured of his wounds, and nothing more is ever heard of him. Some of these incidents occur also in the stories of Finn and Mongan, and those of mysterious begetting of a wonder child and his final disappearance into fairyland are local forms of a tale common to all branches of the Celts. This was fitted to the history of the local god or hero Arthur, giving rise to the local saga, to which was afterwards added events from the life of the historic Arthur. This complex saga must then have acquired a wider fame long before the Romantic cycle took its place, as is suggested by the purely Welsh tales of Coolwich and the Dream of Rhonabwy, in the former of which the personage is gods, of the Mabinogion figure in Arthur's train, though he is far from being the Arthur of the romances. Sporadic references to Arthur occur also in Welsh literature, and to the earlier saga belongs the Arthur who spoils Elysium of its cauldron in a Taliesin poem. In the Triads there is a mingling of the historic, the saga, and the later romance Arthur, but probably as a result of the growing popularity of the saga Arthur, he is added to many Triads as a more remarkable person than the three whom they describe. Arthurian place names over Brythonic area are more probably the result of the popularity of the saga than that of the later Romantic cycle, a parallel instance being found in the extent of Ossianic place names over the Goidelic area as a result of the spread of the Finn saga. The character of the romance Arthur, the flower of knighthood and a great warrior, and the blending of the historic war leader Arthur with the mythic Arthur, suggests that the latter was the ideal hero of certain Brythonic groups, as Finn and Cuchulainn of certain Goidelic groups. He may have been the object of a cult, as these heroes perhaps were, or he may have been a god more and more idealized as a hero. If the earlier form of his name was Artur, a plowman, but perhaps with a wider significance, and having an equivalent in Artaeus, a Gaulish god equated with Mercury, he may have been a god of agriculture who became a war god, but he was also regarded as a culture hero, stealing a cauldron, and also swine from the god's land. The last incident you humorize into the tale of an unsuccessful theft from March. Son of merchant, while, like other culture heroes, he is a bard. To his story was easily fitted that of the Wonder Child, who, having finally disappeared into Elysium, later located at Glastonbury, would reappear one day like Finn as the savior of his people. The local Arthur finally attained a fame far exceeding that of any Brythonic god or hero. Merlin, or Myrddin, appears in the romances as a great magician who is finally overcome by the Lady of the Lake, and is in Geoffrey's son a mysterious, invisible personage who visits a woman, and, finally taking human shape, begets Merlin. As a son who never had a father, he is chosen as a foundation sacrifice for Vortigern's tower by his magicians, but he confutes them and shows why the tower can never be built, namely, because of the dragons in the pool beneath it. Then follow his prophecies regarding the dragons and the future of the country, and the story of his removal of the Giant's Dance, or Stonehenge, from Ireland to its present site, an ideological myth explaining the origin of the Great Stone Circle. His description of how the giants used the water with which they washed the stones to cure sickness or wounds probably points to some ritual for healing in connection with these megaliths. Finally, we hear of his transformation of the lovelorn Uther and of his confidant Ulfin, as well as of himself. Here he appears as little more than an ideal magician, possibly an old god, like the Irish god of Druidism, to whose legend had been attached a story of supernatural conception. Professor R.H. S. regards him as a Celtic Zeus or as the sun, because late legends tell of his disappearance in a glass house into the sea. The glass house is the expanse of light traveling with the sun, Merlin, while the Lady of the Lake, who comes daily to solace Merlin in his enchanted prison, is a dawn goddess. Stonehenge was probably a temple of this Celtic Zeus, whose late legendary self we have in Merlin. Such late romantic episodes in an ideological myth can hardly be regarded as affording safe basis for these views, and their mythological interpretation is more than doubtful. The sun is never prisoner of the dawn, as Merlin is a Vivian. Merlin and his glass house disappear forever, but the sun reappears every morning. Even the most poetic mythology must conform in some degree to actual phenomena, but this cannot be said of the systems of mythological interpretation. If Merlin belongs to the pagan period at all, he was probably an ideal magician or god of magicians, prominent, perhaps, in the Arthur saga as in the later romances, and credited with mysterious origin and an equally mysterious ending, the latter described in many different ways. The boastful Kay of the romances appears already in Coolwich, while in Geoffrey he is Arthur's seneschal. Nobler traits are as in later Welsh poetry. He is a mighty warrior, fighting even against 100, though his powers as a toper are also great. Here, too, his death is lamented. He may thus have been a god of war, and his battle fury may be poetically described in a curious passage referring to him in Coolwich. His breath lasted 9 days and 9 nights under water. He could remain without sleep for the same period. No physician could heal a wound inflicted by his sword. When he pleased, he could make himself as tall as the tallest tree in the wood. And when it rained hardest, whatever he carried remained dry above and below his hand to the distance of a handbreadth. So great was his natural heat. When it was coldest, he was as glowing fuel to his companions. This almost exactly resembles Cuchulain's aspect in his battle fury. In a curious poem, Guinevere extols his prowess as a warrior above that of Arthur, and in Coolwich and elsewhere there is enmity between the two. This may point to Kay's having been a god of tribes hostile to those of whom Arthur was hero. Mabon, one of Arthur's heroes in Coolwich in the Dream of Rhonabwy, whose name, from Map, means a youth, may be one with the god Maponos, equated with Apollo in Britain and Gaul, perhaps as a god of healing springs. His mother's name, Madron, is a local form of Matrona, a river goddess, and probably one of the mother goddesses, as her name implies. In the triads, Mabon is one of the 3 eminent prisoners of Prydian. To obtain his help in hunting the magic boar, his prison must be found, and this is done by animals, in accordance with American formula, while the words spoken by them show the immense duration of his imprisonment, perhaps a hint of his immortality. But he was also said to have died and been buried at Nantle, which, like Gloucester, the place of his prison, may have been a site of his widely extended cult, taken as a whole the various gods and heroes of the Britons, so far as they are known to us, just as they resemble the Irish divinities in having been later regarded as mortals, magicians, and fairies, so they resemble them in their functions, dimly as these are perceived. They are associated with Elysium. They are lords of fertility and growth, of the sea, of the arts of culture and of war. The prominent position of certain goddesses may point to what has already been discovered of them in Gaul and Ireland, their preeminence and independence. But, like the divinities of Gaul and Ireland, those of Wales were mainly local in character, and only in a few cases attained a wider popularity and cult. Certain British gods mentioned on inscriptions may be identified with some of those just considered. Nodons with Nud or Lud, Bellinos with Bellinus or Belly, Maponos with Mabin, Terranos in continental inscriptions only, with a Turon mentioned in Coolwich. Others are referred to in classical writings. Andrasta, a goddess of victory, to whom Boudica prayed. So, a goddess of hot springs, equated with Minerva at Bath. Inscriptions also mention Epona, the horse goddess, Bryagantia, perhaps a form of Bridget, Bellissima, the Mercian Ptolemy, a goddess in Gaulish inscriptions. Others refer to the group goddesses, the Matries. Some gods are equated with Mars, Cumulos, known also on the continent, and perhaps the same as Cumul, father of Finn, Bellaticadros, Comely in slaughter, Cosidius, Carociacus, Barex, and Totatus, perhaps Lucan's Tutates. Others are equated with Apollo and his character as a god of healing, Anaxtiamerus, Grannos, at Musselburgh, and in many continental inscriptions, Arvillus, Mogons, etc. Most of these and many others found on isolated inscriptions were probably local in character, though some, occurring also on the continent, had attained a wider popularity. But some of the inscriptions referring to the latter may be due to Gaulish soldiers quartered in Britain. You have made it this far, and you are still awake. Let's continue to dive into the Celts so we can get you to close your eyes. The Cuchulainn Cycle. The events of the Cuchulainn Cycle are supposed to date from the beginning of the Christian era, King Concobar's death synchronizing with the crucifixion, but though some personages who are mentioned in the annals figure in the tales, on the whole, they deal with persons who never existed. They belong to a world of romance and myth, and embody the ideals of Celtic paganism, modified by Christian influences, and those of classical tales and romantic sagas of other regions, mainly Scandinavian. The present form of the tales as they exist in the Book of the Dun Cow and the Book of Leinster must have been given them in the 7th or 8th century, but they embody materials of far older date. At an early time, the saga may have had a more or less definite form, but new tales were being constantly added to it, and some of the longer tales are composed of incidents which once had no connection with each other. Cuchulainn is the central figure of the cycle, and its central episode is that of the tamed Boquailn or cattle-spoiled coolie. Other personages are Concobar and Dectyre, Ailill and Meb, Fergus, Conall Cernach, Kilroy, Deirdre, and the sons of Usnach. Some of these are divine descent. Some are perhaps euhemerized divinities. Concobar is called Dea Talmaid, a terrestrial god, and Dectyre a goddess. The cycle opens with the birth of Concobar, son of Cathbad and of Nessa, daughter of one of the Tathaday Danann. Though in an older recension of the tale, he is Nessa's son by the god Lug. During Concobar's reign over Ulster, Cuchulainn was born. He was son of Dectyre, either by Swaltame or by her brother Concobar, or by the god Lug, of whom he may also be a reincarnation. Like other heroes of saga, he possesses great strength and skill at a tender age, and, setting out for Concobar's court, overpowers the king's boy Cor, and then becomes their chief. His next adventure is the slaying of the watchdog of Cullen the Smith, and is appeasing the anger of his owner by offering to act as his watchdog. Cathbad now announced that his name would henceforth be Cu Chulainn, Cullen's hound. At the mature age of 7, he obtained Concobar's spears, sword, shield, and chariot, and with these he overcame 3 mighty champions, returning into distortion as battle fury to a mania. To prevent mischief from his rage, the women went forth naked to meet him. He modestly covered his eyes, for it was one of his geasa not to look on a woman's breast. Thus taken unawares, he was plunged into 3 successive vats of cold water until his natural appearance was restored to him, although the water boiled and hissed from his heat. As Cuchulainn grew up, his strength, skill, wisdom, and beauty were unsurpassed. All women fell in love with him, and forestall a series of Bond's fortunes, the men of Ulster sought a wife for him. But the hero's heart was set on Emer, daughter of Fergal, whom he wooed in a strange language which none but she could understand. At last she consented to be his wife, if he would slay a number of warriors. Fergal was opposed to the match, and with a view to Cuchulainn's destruction suggested that he should go to Donal and Alba to increase his skill, and to Scathach if he would excel all other warriors. He agreed, provided that Fergal would give him whatever he asked for on his return. Arrived in Alba, he refused the love of Donal's daughter, Dornala, who swore to be avenged. Thence he went to Scathach, overcoming all the dangers of the way, leaping in safety the gulf surrounding her island, after essaying in vain to cross a narrow, swinging bridge. From Scathach he learned supreme skill in arms, and overcame her Amazonian rival Aif. He begot a son by Aif, and instructed her to call him Conla, to give him his father's ring, to send him to seek Cuchulainn, and to forbid him to reveal his name. In the sequel, Cuchulainn, unaware that Conla was his son, slew him in single combat, too late discovering his identity from the ring which he wore. This is a well-known saga formula of Sorab and Rustum, of Theseus and Hippolytus. On his return from Scathach, Cuchulainn destroyed Fergal's raft with many of its inmates, including Fergal, and carried off Emergency. To the 10 years which followed, during which he was a great champion of Ulster, belong many tales in which he figures prominently. One of these is the debility of the Ultonians. This was caused by Machu, who, during her pregnancy, was forced to run a race with Concobar's horses. She outran them, but gave birth immediately to twins, and, in her pangs, cursed the men of Ulster with a curse that, in time of oppression, they would be overcome with the weakness of childbirth. From this Cuchulainn was exempt, for he was not of Ulster, but a son of Lug. Various attempts have been made to explain this debility. It may be a myth explaining a Celtic use of the kavad, though no example of simultaneous tribal kavad is known, unless we have here an instance of Westermarck's human pairing season in primitive times, with consequent simultaneous birth period for women and kavad for men. Others, with less likelihood, explain it as a period taboo, with cessation from work and warfare at a funeral or festival. In any case, Macha's curse is a myth explanatory of the origin of some existing custom, the duration of which is much exaggerated by the narrator. To this period belong also the tale of Cuchulainn's visit to Elysium, and others to be referred to later. Another story describes his attack upon Morrigan, because she would neither yield up the cows which she was driving away nor tell her true name, an instance of the well-known name taboo. Morrigan took the form of a bird, and was then recognized by Cuchulainn, who poured scorn upon her, while she promised to oppose him during the fight of the Táin in the forms of an eel, a wolf, and a cow, all of which he vowed to destroy. Like many others in the saga, this story is introductory to the main episode of the Táin. To this we now turn. Med had been wife of Concobar, but leaving him, had married in succession 2 chiefs called Aelil, the second of whom had a bull, Finebenak, the white-horned, which he resolved to match by one in every way its equal. Having been refused a brown bull of Quailn, she summoned all her forces to invade Ulster. The moment was inauspicious for Ulster, for all its men were suffering from their debility. Cuchulainn, therefore, went out to encounter the host, and forced Med to agree that a succession of her warriors should engage him in single combat. Among these was his old friend Ferdia, and nothing is so touching as his reluctance to fight him, or so pathetic as his grief when Ferdia falls. The reluctance is primarily due to the tie of blood brotherhood existing between them. Finally, the Ulstermen rose in force and defeated Med, but not before she had already captured the bull and sent it into her own land. There was fought by the Finnbhennach and slew it, rushing back to Ulster with the mangled body on its horns. But in its frenzy of rock seemed to be another bull which it charged. Its brains were dashed out and it fell dead. The Morrigan had warned the bull of the approach of Med's army, and she had also appeared in the form of a beautiful woman to Cuchulainn, offering him her love, only to be repulsed. Hence she turned against him, and described how she would oppose him as an eel, a wolf, and a red heifer, an incident which is probably a variant of that already described. In each of these shapes she was conquered and wounded by the hero, and knowing that none whom he hurt could be healed save by himself, she appeared to him as an old crone milking a cow. At each draught of the milk which he received from her, he blessed her with the blessing of gods and not gods, and so her wounds were healed. For this, at a later time, she tried to ward off his death, but unsuccessfully. During the progress of the Táin, one of Cuchulainn's fairy kinsmen, namely Lug, who announced himself as his father, appeared to aid him, while others of the Dathomiri threw herbs of healing into the streams in which his wounds were washed. During the Táin, Cuchulainn slaughtered the wizard Caladan and his daughters. But Caladan's wife bore 3 posthumous sons and 3 daughters, and through their means the hero was at last slain. Everything was done to keep him back from the host which now advanced against Ulster, but finally one of Caladan's daughters took the form of Niamh and bade him go forth. As he passed the fight, Caladan's daughters persuaded him to eat the flesh of a dog, a fatal deed, for it was one of his Gisa never to eat dog's flesh. So it was that in the fight he was slain by Lugaid, and his soul appeared to the thrice 50 queens who had loved him, chanting a mystic song of the coming of Christ and the day of doom, an interesting example of phantasm coincidental with death. This and other Christian touches show that the Christian redactors of the saga felt tenderly towards the old pagan hero. This is even more marked in the story in which he appears to King Logair and Patrick, begging the former to believe in God and the saint, and praying Patrick to bring me with thy faithful ones unto the land of the living. A similar Christianizing appears in the story of Concobar's death. The result of his mad frenzy on hearing from his druid that an earthquake is a result of the shameful crucifixion of Christ. In the saga, Cuchulainn appears as the ideal Celtic warrior, but like other ideal warriors, he is a magnified, non-natural man, many of his deeds being merely exaggerations of those common among barbaric folk. Even his distortion or battle frenzy is but a magnifying of the wild frenzy of all wild fighters. To the person of this ideal warrior, some of whose traits may have been derived from traditional stories of actual heroes, American and saga episodes attach themselves. Of every ideal hero, Celtic, Greek, Babylonian, or Polynesian, certain things are told: his phenomenal strength as a child, his victory over enormous forces, his visits to the otherworld, his amours with the goddess, his divine descent. These belong to the common stock of folktale episodes and accumulate round every great name. Hence, save in the coloring given to them or the use made of them by any race, they do not afford a key to the mythic character of a hero. Such deeds are ascribed to Cuchulainn, as they doubtless were the ideal heroes of the undivided Aryans, but though parallels may be found between him and the Greek Heracles, they might just as easily be found in non-Aryan regions, e.g. in Polynesia. Thus the parallels between Cuchulainn and Heracles throw little light on the personality of the former, though here and there in such parallels we observe a peculiarly Celtic touch. Thus, While the Greek hero rescues Hesione from a dragon, it is from 3 Fomorians that Cuchulainn rescues Divorgilla, namely, from beings to whom actual human sacrifice was paid. Thus, American formula of worldwide existence has been molded by Celtic religious belief and ritual practice. It was inevitable that the mythological school should regard Cuchulainn as a solar hero. Thus, he reaches his full development at an unusually early age, as the sun does, but also as do many other heroes of saga and Merkin who are not solar. The 3 colors of Cuchulainn's hair, dark near the skin, red in the middle, golden near the top, are claimed to be a description of the sun's rays, or the 3 parts into which the Celts divided the day. Elsewhere his tresses are yellow, like Prince Charlie's in fact and in song, yet he was not a solar hero. Again, the 7 pupils of his eyes perhaps referred to the days of the week. Blindness befell all women who loved him, a reference to the difficulty of gazing at the sun. This is prosaic. The blindness was a compliment paid to Cuchulainn the Blind by women who made themselves blind while talking to him, just as Conall Cernach's mistresses squinted as he did. Cuchulainn's blindness arose from his habit of sinking one eye into his head and protruding the other, a well-known solar trait, his distortion, during which, besides his blindness, blood shot upwards from his head and formed a magic mist, and his anger caused showers of sparks to mount above him, points at dawn or sunset, though the setting sun would rather suggest a hero sinking calmly to rest than a mad giant setting out to slaughter friend and foe. The distortion, as already pointed out, is the exaggerated description of the mad warrior rage, just as the fear which produced death to those who saw him brandish his weapons was also produced by Maori warrior methods. Lug, who may be a sun god, has no such distortion. The cooling of the hero in 3 vats, the waters of which boil over and his emergence from them pinky red in color, symbolize the sun sinking into the waters and reappearing at dawn. Might it not describe in an exaggerated way the refreshing bath taken by frenzied warriors, the water being supposed to grow warm from the heat of their bodies? One of the heroes' Gisa was not to see Manannan's horses, the waves, which, being interpreted, means that the sun is near its death as it approaches the sea. Yet Lug, a sun god, rides a steed in bar, a personification of the waves, while Cuchulainn himself often crossed the sea, and also lived with the sea god's wife, Fand, without coming to grief. Again, the magic horses which he drives, black and gray in color, are symbols of day and night, though it is not obvious why a gray horse should symbolize day, which is not always gray in the Isles of the West. Unlike a solar hero, too, Cuchulainn is most active in winter and rests for a brief space from slaughtering at midday, the time of the sun's greatest activity both in summer and winter. Another theory is that every visit of the hero to a strange land signifies a descent to Hades, suggested by the sun sinking in the west. Skathaka's island may be Hades, but it is more probably Elysium with some traits borrowed from the Christian idea of hell. But Emer's land, also visited by Cuchulainn, suggests neither Hades nor Elysium. Emer calls herself Injin Rig Rikisgarda, translated by Professor R.H. Carrot as daughter of the cold-faced king, i.e., she is daughter of darkness. Hence, she is a dawn maiden and becomes the sun hero's wife. There is nothing in the story to corroborate this theory, apart from the fact that it is not clear, even to the hypothetical primitive mind, why dawn and sun should be a divine pair. Emer's words probably mean that she is daughter of a king and a flame of hospitality, Rikisgarda. Cuchulainn, in visiting her, went from west to east, contrary to the apparent course of the sun. The extravagance of the solar theory is further seen in the hypothesis that because Cuchulainn has other wives, the sun god made love to as many dawn maidens as there are days in a year, like the king in Louis's romance with his wives, one for each day of the year, leap year included. Further examples of the solar theory need not be cited. It is enough to see in Cuchulainn the ideal warrior, whose traits are bombastic and obscure exaggerations of actual custom and warfare, or are borrowed from folktale motifs not exclusively Celtic. Possibly he may have been a war god, since he is associated with Bad 481 and also with Morrigan, but he has also some traits of a culture hero. He claims superiority in wisdom, in law, in politics, in the art of the Philid, and in druidism, while he brings various things from the world of the gods for 82. In any case, the Celts paid divine honors to heroes, living or dead, and Cuchulainn, god or ideal hero, may have been the subject of cult. This lends point to the theory of M. Darbois that Cuchulainn and Conall Cernach are the equivalents of Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, said by Diodorus to be worshipped among the Celts near the ocean. Cuchulainn, like Pollux, was son of a god, and was nursed, according to some accounts, by Finchum, mother of Conall, just as Leda was mother of Castor as well as of Pollux. But, on the other hand, Cuchulainn, unlike Pollux, was mortal. Darbois then identifies the two pairs of heroes with certain figures on an altar at Cluny. These are Castor and Pollux, Cernunnos and Smirtullos. He equates Castor with Cernunnos, and Pollux with Smirtullos. Smirtullos is Cuchulainn, and the name is explained from an incident in the Táin, in which the hero, reproached for his youth, puts on a false beard before attacking Morgan in her form as an eel. This is expressed by Smirthain, to attach, and is thus connected with and gave rise to the name Smirtullos. On the altar, Smirtullos is attacking an eel or serpent. Hence Pollux is Smirtullos Cuchulainn. Again, the name Cernunno signifies the horned one, from Cernu, horn, a word found in Conall's epithet Cernach. But this was not given him because he was horned, but because of the angular shape of his head, the angle, cern, being the result of a blow. The epithet may mean victorious. On the whole, the theory is more ingenious than convincing, and we have no proof that the figures of Castor and Pollux on the altar were duplicates of the Celtic pair. Cernunnos was an underworld god, and Conall has no trace of such a character. Darbois also traces a saga in Gaul in the fact that on the menhir of Curvedale Mercury is figured with child, Mercury, in his opinion, being Lug, and the child, Cuchulainn. On another altar are depicted a woodman, a Zeus, cutting down a tree, and a bull on which are perched 3 birds, Tarvos Trigeranos. The two subjects, as Reinach points out, are combined on another altar at Treves, on which a woodman is cutting down a tree in which are perched 3 birds, while a bull's head appears in the branches. These represent, according to M. Darbois, incidents of the Táin, the cutting down of trees by Cuchulainn and placing in the way of his enemies, and the warning of the bull by Morrigan in the bird form which she shared with her sisters Bab and Machu. Why, then, is Cuchulainn called Esus? Esus comes from a root which gives words meaning rapid motion, anger, strength, all shown by the hero. The altars were found in the land of the Belgic Treverai, and some Belgic tribes may have passed into Britain and Ireland carrying the Esus Cuchulainn legend there in the 2nd century BC, e.g. the Satantii, dwelling by the Mersey, and bearing a name similar to that of the hero in his childhood, Satana Satantios, as well as the Menapii and Brigantes, located in Ireland by Ptolemy. In other words, the divine Esus, with his surname Smirtullos, was called in Ireland Satanta, after the Satantii, and at a later date, Cuchulainn. The princely name Donatorus resembles Dawn Tarb, the brown bull of the saga, and also suggests its presence in Gaul, while the name Greek, Diataros, perhaps the equivalent to Kerauioteros divine bull, is found in Galatia. Thus the main elements of the saga may have been known to the continental Celts before it was localized in Ireland, and it may be added. If it was brought there by Gallo-British tribes, this might account for the greater popularity of the native, possibly pre-Celtic, Finsaga among the folk, as well as the finer literary quality of the Cuchulainn saga. But the identification of Esus with Cuchulainn rests on slight grounds. The names Esus and Smirtullos are not found in Ireland, and the Gaulish Esus worship with human sacrifice, has little affinity with the hero, unless his deeds of slaughter are reminiscent of such rites. It is possible, however, that the episode of the Táin came from a myth explaining ritual acts. This myth may have been the subject of the bas-reliefs, carried to Ireland, and they're worked into the saga. The folk versions of the saga, though resembling the literary versions, are less elaborate and generally wilder, and perhaps represent its primitive form. The greatest differences are found in versions of the Táin and of Cuchulainn's death, which, separate in the saga, are parts of one folk tale, the death occurring during the fighting over the bull. The bull is his property, and Med sends Garb Mac staring to take it from him. He pretends to be a child, goes to bed, and tricks Garb, who goes off to get the bull. Cuchulainn arrives before him and personates the herdsman. Each seizes a horn, and the bull is torn in two. Does this represent the primitive form of the Táin? And further, were the bull and Cuchulainn once one and the same? A bull, the incarnation of a god or vegetation spirit, being later made anthropomorphic. A hero god whose property or symbol is a bull. Instances of this process are not unknown among the Celts. In India, Indra was a bull and a divine youth. In Greece, there was a bull Dionysus, and among the Celts the name of the divine bull was borne by kings. In the saga, Morgan is friendly to the bull, but fights for Med, but she is now friendly, now hostile to Cuchulainn. Finally, however, trying to avert his doom. If he had once been the bull, her friendliness would not be quite forgotten. Once he became human and separate from the bull. When she first met Cuchulainn, she had a cow on whom the brown bull was to beget a calf, and she told the hero that, so long as the calf which is in this cow's body is a yearling, it is up to that time that thou art in life, and it is this that will lead to the Táin. This suggests that the hero was to die in the battle, but it shows that the brown bull's calf is bound up his life. The bull was a reincarnation of a divine swineherd, and if, as in the case of Cuchulainn, his rebirth could only be of himself, the calf was simply a duplicate of the bull, and as it was bound up with the hero's life, bull and hero may well have been one. The life or soul was in the calf, and, as in all such cases, the owner of the soul and that in which it is hidden are practically identical. Cuchulainn's distortion might then be explained as representing the bull's fury in fight, and the folk tales would be popular forms of an old myth explaining ritual in which a bull, the incarnation of a tree or vegetation spirit, was slain, and the sacred tree cut down and consumed, as in Celtic agricultural ritual. This would be the myth represented on the bas-reliefs, and in the ritual the bull would be slain, rent, and eaten by his worshippers. Why, then, should Cuchulainn rend the bull? In the later stages of such rites the animal was slain, not so much as a divine incarnation, as a sacrifice to the god once incarnated in him. And when a god was thus separated from his animal form, myths often arose telling how he himself had slain the animal. In the case of Cuchulainn and the bull, the god represented by the bull became separate from it, became anthropomorphic, and in that form was associated with, or actually was a hero, Cuchulainn. Bull sacrifices were common among the Celts with whom the bull had been a divine animal. Possibly a further echo of this myth and ritual is to be found in the folk belief that Martin was cut up and eaten in the form of an ox, the god incarnate and the animal being associated with a saint. Thus the literary versions of the Táin, departing from the hypothetical primitive versions, kept the bull as the central figure, but introduced a rival bull and described its death differently. While both bulls are said to be reincarnations of divine swineherds, the idea of a fight for a bull is borrowed from actual custom, and thus the old form of the story was further distorted. The Cuchulainn saga is more coherent than the Finn saga because it possesses one central incident. The canon of the saga was closed at an early date, while that of Finn has practically never been closed, mainly because it has been more a saga of the folk than that of Cuchulainn. In some respects the two may have been rivals, for the Cuchulainn saga was introduced by conquerors from Britain or Gaul. It would not be looked on with favor by the folk. Or if it is a saga of Ulster as opposed to that of Leinster, rivalry would again ensue. The Finn saga lives more in the hearts of the people, though it sometimes borrows from the other. This borrowing, however, is less than some critics, e.g. Zimmer, maintain. Many of the likenesses are the result of the fact that wherever a hero exists, a common stock of incidents becomes his. Hence, there is much similarity in all sagas wherever found. Thank you for listening. Have a good night's sleep. And if you're still awake, click on another video.